the world is in this place right now. And so how do we go from Zoom to spirit of Zoom? So in 5 minutes, we'll see if we can look at that. So I think we can all acknowledge that we are in a room together, some kind of room. We're all familiar with the space. You can say we are in a Zoom room. And this is sort of my diagram of a Zoom room. You have your view and then other views. Like any other room, by view, I don't just mean your little screen, but philosophically, like how you see the world, your opinions, your ideas, your personal stories, your landscape, the place that you're from, what land you're sitting on, your view that informs your worldview, and you're surrounded by other views. And for most of us, when we're in a room, whether it be a Zoom room or a real physical place, there is a feeling of, I'd say the opposite of spirit, but a feeling of other, self and other, right? A feeling of separateness, a feeling of not necessarily connecting to the other people in the room. And so as through my own practices over the past 20, 25 years of meditation and listening, I've learned to just look at that experience and start to tune into other views. So like the noise that is your own thoughts and your own opinions starts to quiet, and you're able to tune into other views. And then there's a shift. And so I did spend about 1.5 years in silent meditation retreat. And there's a point in the process of listening and quieting, and I would say connecting to genius in the sense of connecting to spirit, where it stops becoming my view, other views. It just becomes view, an ability to connect, an ability to appreciate, respect, and listen to everyone that is in the room, the container, the place with you. And so how does that apply? All right, so if we look at what I just took you through, I would call that a stage of transformation, which I can talk you through intellectually, but in your path or journey, it can take years. In terms of learning how to design with the spirit of place in mind, training yourself to be able to tune in to different processes and experiences. So something happened between this slide and this slide. Like it can be like years of practice between one and the other, where you're able to, you can call the word transcend, expand, evolve beyond our own limited view, and one that can encompass a larger view, an expanded view. And so I'd say what happened, simply put, is that it got something about your own preconceived notions, constructs, limiting beliefs got quiet, and an ability to listen opened. And I'd say that's sort of the foundation of my practice as a designer, as an artist, is getting to that moment right there. And so how does this apply, let's say when we go on a site visit or go walk on a piece of land, place, go visit some place and you're looking around. So it's a similar process. So this is a picture Marissa took of us on a recent site visit to one of our projects in Auburn. I'm standing on a rock, feeling the rock. And so you have your view, my view. You've got bird's eye view, tree's eye view, colonizer's eye view. Oh wait, did I skip a slide? Tree's eye view, indigenous eyes view, rock's eye view, gnome's eye view, worm's eye view, all sorts of ways to experience the world around you. And so, whoops, I skipped this slide. Okay, we're on a site visit, starts here. It doesn't get specific. It's just kind of like bluish, sunny, breezy, fuzzy texture, smells like a goat, rock. And then there is a transformation where it goes from this to this slide that I skipped to too quickly. It's like when I first step onto the land, this was like initial impressions. And then going from those sort of initial impressions to one that acknowledges that there are other perspectives that might not be human, female, 40 years old, bird's eye view, tree's eye view, colonizer's eye view, indigenous eyes view. I think my favorite, a real turning point in our practice was when we drew our first gnome's eye view map. Now I should have brought that, Marissa. Oh, maybe if you text it to me, it's okay. One of our first projects, we drew a gnome's eye view map of the project, which was like so helpful. I remember in undergrad, the first time I was asked to draw a worm's eye view of the site was also just like, whoa, what does it look like from underneath if I was looking up? So I feel like these are really, really good tools, whether it's like a creative prompt, like what would the tree see this property as, this land as? What would the spirit of the indigenous ghost that's still stuck there see the land as? And you can try and tune in the story and imagine what is there, feel it. And so that's a deep part of our practice, is consciously letting go of, let's say, the dominant, most obvious, visible experience of the land and allowing other experiences to come into relevance, acknowledgement. And then there's that magical moment where your view as the controlling designer that wants to do something to the land just stops, it stops being like, or what the client wants, like that all just, there's this space which is just, I would call it like the place of opportunity, where everything feels possible, where it's just, this for me is the space where I connect to the spirit of land, where through those processes or practices of imagining what a gnome under the rock might experience, or what a bird might see, or, and all of those views almost harmonize into a feeling of knowing, a feeling of meeting, a feeling of greeting the spirit of the land as we've come to practice it and experience the land. And so I was raised with Chinese speaking parents and very much influenced by the traditional Chinese cultural methodologies of landscape and energy. And so I often reference things in Chinese, which gives me a nice balance to my Western canonical education. So I feel like both sides of my brain are balanced. And so that word that I just sort of shared with you, view, in Chinese, the word that comes to mind is not literally view, but it's the word for perception or to think or to know, that feeling of knowing, perceiving. It's the Chinese word xiang. And it's this beautiful character that has on one side tree. This is a character for tree. This is a character for eye. And this is a character for heart. And so it's this idea of, even in this picture, sort of the perception of the exterior world, but then directed towards the inner landscape, your heart, and how the whole thing informs a way of perceiving and knowing. And I feel this to be such a better way of understanding think versus the rational Cartesian idea that the mind is up here, but that the mind and the field of knowing is something that moves through the heart, that moves through the senses, that moves through the landscape and through trees and nature to create the consciousness of perception, right? Because I feel like this character embodies that interchange that's in the previous slide. Will it show up? Yes, this. is in this character. And so a little bit more vocabulary so that we can all be on the same page. Okay. Ooh. Another one of the words that we use to describe this experience is tuning into phenomena, right? And so the I tends to be the dominant sense that we use. And so when I try and tune into the spirit of the land or work with the spirit of the land, I try to reduce the supremacy of the visible sense and allow the phenomenal landscape of the audible, the tangible, and my favorite, the fathomable, to awaken, along with the invisible, the inaudible, the intangible, and the unfathomable. So there's an Indian architect that I've admired, and Charles Correa, and he says that the ancient Vedic architect knew how to leave 50% of the building to God, the unfathomable, that which we cannot know. So how in our design process, we like to control everything. How can we get to a place where we're not only are we okay with it, we allow ourselves to work with the unknown and the unknowable. And for me, that's integral to working with the spirit of place and acknowledging how that's guiding the process. So phenomena comes from the Greek phaenon, which means to appear, to reveal, or to bring to light. And when we apply it towards land or landscape, you can call it phenomenal land. And so when we describe our process or how we've come to know our process and make conscious is a phenomenal landscape process. And I'm influenced a lot by Chinese calligraphy and this union of word and image. And in one of my Chinese calligraphy books, he writes, Jean-François Billetier, the alchemy of perception, which we've been describing for the past few minutes, leads to the simultaneous reappropriation of oneself in the world. There's this aha moment where you have a place, where you're in a place. And so I consider myself an artist. I don't quite identify as a landscape architect. Yesterday in a client meeting, the architect called me the landscape architect. And I was like, what? Marissa, I'm not licensed. I'm like, Elizabeth is a landscape architect. I'm the artist. And so I still very much understand landscape. Though I practice landscape design, I very much consider it the art of landscape. And I think of myself as an artist. And so the art of landscape arises for me when the alchemy of perception creates a reintegration of self and world. And it's through this whole process that I'm sharing with you. And I think perhaps now more than ever, I feel like this is something that we really need, humanity, in this really traumatic time that's dislocating. The pandemic, the placelessness, the genius of Zoom not always being a genius. And so how can we look at the art of landscape as a way to bring communities together and allow us to feel a sense of place in a time of placelessness? I don't have an answer to that. That's just a prompt. Okay, so a few more vocabulary background. So all of these ideas that I'm sharing with you, a lot of them are foundational to just traditional Chinese consciousness around landscape. And so I'm sure many of you have heard the concept of feng shui, which is this character here, which is wind and water. So like the bagua, like the octagonal thing, or like you can't put this here because that'll give you bad luck. Like these are all sort of popularized versions of feng shui. But feng shui in its original form, I think, is less rules that seem superstitious. They're only superstitious because the consciousness that led to those rules has been lost. The consciousness of feng shui is communication with the spirit of the land. But because we've lost that ability to connect to the wind and the water, we just have what's come down are just what seems like arbitrary rules or even superstitious rules. And so when I do landscape, I often refer to feng shui, but I don't hold to the rules necessarily. I'm more interested in connecting to the consciousness that led to those rules 3,000 years ago. And so feng shui falls within a larger category in traditional Chinese cultural practices called shan shui, which is mountain on water, these 2 characters, which is just another word for, well, it's the description of landscape. And unlike the Western traditions of landscape painting, shan shui is like a union of philosophy, landscape, poetry, calligraphy, poems about landscape. And so I was deeply influenced by landscape as a cross-disciplinary philosophical art, right? So I don't, for me, landscape architecture is so limiting in that you only like build things in the outer world that fit in like someone's backyard. Like that's not landscape. Landscape in at least traditional Chinese culture is a way of being in a poetic world where the landscape, where the inner and outer world are like mirrors of each other. And so this is a painting by Bada Sanren, which is one of my mother's favorite artists. His name means 8 big mountain man. And he was so free with his lines, and like many great landscape painters of his time, these are not real landscapes. It's not like he went on plein air with a sketchbook and was like drawing landscape. Often these are just, they're imaginaries. They're not supposed to be real. They're supposed to be they're supposed to be inner landscapes. And they're read as the inner landscape as the painter. And it came to be the landscape garden tradition within Asia grew out of these poems and inner landscapes. And it was like this dialogue between the inside and the outside. And so my MFA thesis is called Between Sight and Psyche. And I wrote about this and explored this liminal space, which is an ancient space where you can go between the sight and the psyche. And so this brings us to the word genius loci. Genius, of course, means spirit. And if you guys haven't seen, there's an amazing TED Talk by Elizabeth Gilbert about genius. And it's so funny. She argues, and I 100% agree, that our current Western understanding of genius as like you being the genius, like you're the genius, it forgets the original Latin understanding of genius, which is something that you collaborate with that's not yours. Like there's genius gens, which is the genius of your family, so your ancestors. There's the genius loci, which is the genius of the land, which is who you work with if you're an architect. It's not you, like you're not the genius. Like in our modernity, where we've been cut off and created like the cult of the starchitect, we've taken credit for spirit, whereas the original usage in Latin is that this is the genius was the spirit that you connected with and collaborated with. And you know, what a relief when you can take the burden of genius off of your own egoic expression and needs and just be like, okay, that's something I'm working with, that's not me. So I think that's been super helpful just in our own creative process to not then identify with our creation as ours, but as something that we are co-creating with. And then of course, loci, location, locus. Loci is the plural of locus, which is place. So genius loci, spirit of place. This is a universal concept. You see it in cultures all over the world. It's been popularized in landscape architecture because we have Western European roots, and Latin is sort of foundational. I also studied Latin for a long time, 5 years, and I lived in Italy for a semester to study architecture. So I have a very sweet spot for genius loci of Rome, and also the word itself. And the stones of Rome do talk. It's quite phenomenal. I think what's just as interesting is the word for genius loci in Chinese, which is less talked about, but just as important. So the word for genius loci in Chinese is she. If we were on a lecture hall, I'd make you all say it, but don't unmute, that'll be crazy. So you can just try to just say she. And it has two parts, right? On one side, you have spirit, and on one side, you have soil or earth. So if I just break down these characters for you, this is the modern version. This is the sort of seal script. This is the most ancient oracle script, which was originally carved on tortoise shells for divination rituals. And so you see how this radical became this radical, which became this radical. Radical means root. And so if you look at the most ancient form of the character for spirit in Chinese, this horizontal line can mean heaven or the ground. So here it means the sky. And then these lines are the energy coming down from the heavens, right? So this is from up above coming down. So it means divine spirit, right? This character here is tree. And then this character here, we have two horizontals and a vertical. This vertical is the axis mundi, the universal central pillar. The Chinese call it kun, K-U-N. And then the axis mundi is, it bisects the firmament, and then it's held by the ground. So you have soil or ground. And so together you have land. It became simplified over time to reduce the tree, and we're like, well, we don't need the tree, we'll just keep land or soil. So these three together, you get spirit of the land. You can look it up. There's so many different ways it's broken down. It's also God of soil. I like this one. And then in modern day usage, it came to mean society. So for those of you who speak Chinese, 社会, society, comes from this, it has this word, spirit of the land, in society. And the way that etymology came about was because how is a society formed? It's people brought together by a common spirit of the land through shared rituals. Often they would do shared sacrifices towards the spirit of the land. And so the community that formed around the spirit of the land came to be the society. So I think that's super interesting because the Latin doesn't have that same nuance, but I think it brings the all-important social dimension to our work, and how connecting to the land connects us to people and tribes and communities. You know, like when you connect to the land, you're not like talking to the earth and the soil only. You connect as a landscape designer, and you're constantly connecting with communities, and that's a big part of connecting to the spirit of place. Okay, so I think it's important to note that though I, have all these romantic notions about landscape, and when you see my paintings, I often forget to tell people that I'm born and raised in Manhattan. So I think it's, my genius loci is concrete and high rises. Like I was born and raised in Midtown Manhattan. Like this is what the view out of my window kind of looks like: water towers, awnings, taxis, patch of grass. And so and I remember growing up, like I thought nature was Central Park. And like the more I've been studying Central Park, the more I'm like, I mean, it's crazy. You know, they used more dynamite to blow up the rocks there than they used to create the Battle of Gettysburg field. Sorry, the field that's became that battleground. But it's like, it's so not natural. Central Park is the opposite of natural. It's, you can say, the origin of landscape architecture, often described as the origin of landscape architecture as a discipline, because it's so fabricated. And yet for most New Yorkers, I grew up there in the 80s and 90s, you think it's like the last patch of nature left on Manhattan, whereas it's far from that. It's a constructed imaginary. And so for me, this is how it connects to the Chinese landscape tradition, which is that I deliberately created it so that it looks like the painting, because it feels like a colonist's nostalgic view of the old world and wanting to place it in a new world. So the archetypes of the pastoral, the formal, picturesque, you know, whatever I'm sure you can just, if you've studied Central Park yet, it created the paradigms of what the colonizers wanted to bring from their home here, and has nothing to do with the actual indigenous land other than completely colonizing it. So it's a great example of a colonized landscape. And I think really important, at least for me, over the process, from watching myself go from thinking that it was the spirit of the land, like Central Park is nature, like it's, and then being like, whoa, like this is European settlers imposing nostalgic old world archetypes, not unlike the Chinese landscape painters, but brutalizing the land to create these forms. So I think it's really important to have that understanding. At least for me, that's like a 20-year trajectory from this is nature to this is nature that's not natural. Yeah. So the other big landscape that influenced me was Arizona. We'll get there. But between New York and Yale, when I got to Yale, I sort of immersed myself in creating a language and landscape. And so I wrote my thesis on yoga and architecture, so specifically the subtle body and how Eastern paradigms of the body inform architectural form. And at first they didn't want me to write the thesis. They asked me to write about Corbusier. And I was like, what is there to write about Corbusier? It's like so done. And so they actually tried to stop me from writing this sort of non-Western canonical thesis. And it went all the way up to the dean at the time, Dean Stern. And they sent me to my mentor, now my mentor, still my mentor, Kent Bloomer. And when I walked into his office, he said, they send me all the crazies. So I've been sort of pushing the envelope. This was 20 years ago when I wrote this. And so I'm sharing you some of my initial notes. So I was always interested in how the body could start to create experience and notations. So I started just documenting my movement practice. At the time, I was like super into yoga. And I just found that if I made one down dog, made 3, made 5, and then if I accumulated it, I started to create mountains. And so I started to, just inspired by my Chinese cultural heritage of merging the word with the landscape, how can I create notations that started to blend, you can say, word and landscape. And I took that really far. And this was like a 3-month drawing. It's like 8 feet. And this became one of my thesis drawings, where I was just exploring how using notation, we can create notations of the body, can create landscapes and forms that can be pathways that you travel through. And I made these maps for a couple of years and started to go to different sites. So I went to Tibet and visited the Potala Palace. And then I came back and I made this 15-foot mural. You know, if I were to stand in front of it, I'd like come up to here. but basically of different figures. These are all figures and words moving through the landscape. Okay, next. Okay, and so all of that led to a period of silence. And so I got really into my yoga practice and meditation practice. And I trained for about 4 years to meditate for long periods of time. And then my partner and I, now my husband, we embarked on a 1.5 year long silent meditation retreat in the Chiricahua Mountains in Arizona. And so this was really, really, really important for my understanding of the spirit of the land, because I'm from Manhattan and I moved from Manhattan to the middle of nowhere, Arizona. And it was sacred Apache land. And so I effectively got the concrete out of my system. And I made these drawings. So I made about, I don't even know, like over 1,000 drawings during that time. And I would just paint the landscape. And so as I painted the landscape, I would just go into zones of just pure energy, chi. And so here's a mountain outside my retreat cabin. Oops. And then about midway through the retreat, there was this moment of transformation where it felt like the chi or the energy between my body and the landscapes didn't seem separate anymore. And painting my body and painting the landscape no longer seemed like two distinct activities. And my work changed. And I started to make these sort of cosmic maps of energy that merge the outer landscape and the inner landscape. So you can see the axis mundi. It kind of looks like the spirit of place character. It's like you have, whoops. Sorry, how do I go back? Here we go. One more slide. So having the spirit of place kind of merge into my practice in this way. And I realized that I was heavily influenced by my mother's Taoist practice. So for those of you who are familiar with Taoism, Tao means path, and fundamental to Taoism is this understanding of qi or energy. And so there are two fundamental principles of Taoism that inform Chinese landscape practices. And it's this distinction, or not distinction, you can call it personal qi, like of the body, and then cosmic qi, which is in the world. And so cosmic qi, you can say, connects individual circuits to the collective, like that idea of society connected through the spirit of place would be like an expression of cosmic qi. And then if you've ever worked with an acupuncturist or Tai Chi, that's personal qi. And so in my understanding and practice of landscape, it's playing with those two, your personal qi and the cosmic qi, the social energy and collective. And so it's this thread of qi that intersects and threads Chinese landscape, painting, poetry, and calligraphy. And obviously, if you look at traditional Chinese paintings or things like that, mine is nothing like that. We've interpreted these ideas and brought them into contemporary practice. I mean, I made these paintings about 10, 15 years ago. And I'm now building work that doesn't necessarily look like this, but in a 20-minute presentation, I feel like these images give you a sense of my philosophical position and influences. So this is one of the final drawings I'll share with you today. And one last word that I hope to demystify for you is Kung Fu. It's probably like the most misunderstood Chinese word. And as like, as someone whose last name was Kang, so I took my husband's last name Dreyfus, but I'm like thinking of changing it back to Kang because of all of the all of the Asian hate. I really like reclaimed my Asian identity just to be like, hey, we need to be visible here. So Gong Fu, so Kung Fu in Chinese is Gong Fu, and it simply means practice, right? And it doesn't even mean martial arts. I think the biggest misunderstanding that Kung Fu is that it's about battle or that fighting. This practice, I would call it the practice of cosmicizing. So making something cosmic falls under a larger umbrella that's known as Kung Fu. So Gong means skillful work or training. It also means something that you undertake, an undertaking. And Fu means time spent, craft, how much time you place into that thing that you wish to accomplish. And so together, Gong Fu means skillful work or dedicated training. And last Chinese word lesson is en plein air in Chinese is 室外功夫, which is outdoor kung fu. I didn't make this up. I can show it to you in the book. It's this idea that when you're outside with the land, sketching it, engaging it, it's a style of kung fu, right? So it's not just martial arts, like the landscape arts are considered a form of kung fu and historically called working outside poetry. And I feel like that's been really helpful for me in terms of how I understand my work as a spiritual process of working outside poetry. And the purpose of your kung fu, of your process, is that it leaves the frame of your work and extends out into the cosmos, into society. And so Liz wanted me to talk a little bit about what I do. I think this is like the last slide. Somehow this all became my day job, which I think is really hilarious. So all of these processes we've made into a studio process called Make Conscious, but specifically working with spirit of place and applying that to all the different modalities of design in the world, using these ancient concepts of mind and chi and landscape. And so we work in home, interior, landscape. At the center is practice. So I teach meditation every morning. We also do some work with labs. So we do social experiments, EDU classes, and then we're even trying to bring this into branding, sort of how this form of communication can bring that into how we tell our story. Yeah, so thanks. If you have any questions, or I didn't show any like current landscape projects. I like checked all of them and none of them wanted to be shared because they're not done yet. So I was like, I want to share them when like we actually have broken ground and we can take photos of them. So we have about, Liz and Marissa and I have about 3 or 4 landscape projects going on right now, and one of them breaks ground in a couple months. So maybe in a year you'll have some photos.
Thank you, Jessica. That was amazing. You guys must have some questions. I can stop recording.